Hi guys, welcome back to Breakfast Japan. It's Matt here, and today we're going to be reacting to a very interesting video. It's called "The Myth of Input," and it's by Kangaroo English. Before I get into this, I just want to say I'm not having a dig at this guy, and I'm not, trying to attack him or anything. I just felt that this was a very interesting video, and I kind of had to react to it because um, it's got a lot of views, and a lot of what this guy is talking about, I just feel like is just wrong and is giving poor advice out to the community, and so I felt like I had to kind of talk about it. And yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting video. It's a bit odd, to say the least. But as far as I know, this guy's a great guy. I've heard he's done like charity and stuff, and he raises a lot of money to set up schools. So I don't know why he feels this way about input and the input hypothesis, but I guess let's get into it and see what he has to say. I'm going to listen to it on 2 times speed because he does talk very slowly. He's an English teaching channel for people learning English, so he purposely talks slowly, I think. So I'm just going to speed it up whilst we watch this. So let's get into it.
Anyone who has tried to learn a language knows that there are a million different learning systems and methods out there, and a million different people trying to sell them to you. But after a while, you will probably notice one idea that everybody seems to believe in, and that is the importance of input. Sometimes entire learning programs are based only on providing input, and
That's very interesting. I've never actually heard anybody say that. I don't think that's the case. From my look upon the language learning community as a whole, that is certainly not the case. A lot of the emphasis is put on speaking from day one. It's put on classes where you're forced to talk from a very early stage. And I don't think that's really a thing. Like courses like Duolingo and stuff, there's no emphasis on input. And I've not personally. The only course that I've seen that's heavily focused on input is LingQ. That's not really a course. It's more a very fancy reading editor with audio, unless they've changed in the last few years. But when I used it a while ago, 3 or 4 years ago, that was essentially what it was. And so, I don't know. I don't think that's really
on the idea
quite
that
right,
input is the only thing you need to learn a language. The main reason this idea is so powerful is due to the influence of one man, Stephen Krashen, who is often viewed as a legendary figure in the world of language learning. He proposed the input hypothesis back in the 1970s, and his ideas have been enormously popular and very influential on the world of language learning during the last 50 years. And in 20...
I'm going to disagree on that. I don't think it's been that influential. Stephen Krashen produced the input hypothesis along with a bunch of other theory behind why we acquire language the way we do. And he wrote that a while ago. In fact, I did some research on this for my final year project at uni, and it was very hard to find other research that backed up his research and talked about it. There was a group of people that were very around Krashen that agreed with his work and sort of helped him out. But from what it looked like, a lot of people disagreed with him. Most of the linguists at the time, were very heavily into grammar, and they were adamant that grammar was the way of going about things, that you must structure the language. Krashen's notion of acquiring language by just understanding messages was just rejected by a lot of the people at the time. It hasn't been that influential. The only when I started learning Japanese, it was just very interesting, right? So when I started learning Japanese back in 2015, I searched and searched and searched for this idea of input. I didn't really know what I was searching for, but I had a hunch. I had a hunch from back when I was learning languages in school that wasn't the right way of doing things, and that why couldn't we learn like we could as kids? And it kind of just naturally felt right that was the way to go about it. So when I started learning in 2015, started learning Japanese, I figured that doing research on that idea and sort of looking that up might help. I didn't once come across anything to do with Stephen Krashen, and I didn't once come across anything to do with the input hypothesis and input in general. The thing that I came across was a blog by a dude that learned Japanese using immersion and using input, But that was the thing that I came across. And even then, there was no one else doing this. I actually recorded videos of me, talking about my progress doing what this guy had done on this blog. But I was so nervous that I didn't, because I didn't know that it would work or not, because no one else was talking about that kind of stuff on the internet. I couldn't find anybody talking about it. And it's only been in the past 6 years or so that this has suddenly started to blow up, with people like Matt vs. Japan taking off and getting, tons of subscribers. And so, yeah, it just doesn't seem like it's that well spread and it's been that influential. But I guess it can kind of seem that way on the YouTube side of things, on the online side of things, because a lot of people, there are a lot of creators that say that we should use input and we should use the input hypothesis and immersion and that kind of things, which isn't wrong. That's what we should be doing. That is the way to acquire language. That's how I've done it. That's how tons of other people have done it. So I've done it.
2021, you will still find him repeating his now famous mantra that we acquire language in only one way, when we understand it. Here is Krashen in his own words.
The core contribution, I think, is that we acquire language in only one way, when we understand it. Most people call that comprehensible input. We don't acquire language when we speak. We don't acquire language when we study it. We don't acquire language when we memorize lists of verbs, etc., etc. We don't acquire language when we get corrected. All those things, like grammar, vocabulary, are the result of getting comprehensible input.
It sounds great, right? No speaking, no study, just input. It's the dream of any language learner. There's just one little problem with the input hypothesis. It's total. Now, I know...
Bloody hell. That is... That is a hell of a segment, I can tell you that. So, I don't want to be mean to this guy, but not only did he take that footage of Krashen from Matt vs. Japan's channel, where he did an interview with Krashen on the input hypothesis. I don't know if this guy has ever seen Matt's stuff, but he must have. He must have seen the interview between him and Krashen, so he must know who Matt is, and he must have seen Matt's, Japanese and I don't understand how you can be saying that the input hypothesis is when you're taking a segment of someone who's acquired near native level fluency in a language through input and through immersion. It's insane. Obviously, that's not the only thing that Matt has done, and that's not the only thing that you need to do to get to that level of fluency. You do need speaking practice. You do need to be able to shadow natives and actually learn about accent and learn all these different things. It's not just input that is correct in if he's talking about it in that way. But when it comes down to actually acquiring the language, getting the language into your head and understanding it, there is only one way of doing that, and that is through comprehensible input. Whether the input is comprehensible because you're actually seeking comprehensible input, or whether you're actually just immersing yourself in the language, and then every now and then you hear something you can understand, and therefore you subconsciously acquire it or not. Either way, that is how we work, how our brains work to acquire language, and that's how kids do it, and that's how we do it as adults as well. It's just how it works. And everything on top of that is just refining your speech, you're refining your writing. It's not necessarily acquiring the language, it's perfecting a skill. And so when it comes down to it, it is about input.
This is dangerous ground, because I am talking about a person that is highly respected, and his ideas are the foundation of a lot of language learning programs. But I truly believe in the principle of error
That's not
correction,
true.
created by the great sociolinguist William Labov, who said that a person who becomes aware of an idea with important consequences that has errors has an obligation to talk about those errors with the widest possible audience. And
I would just say Krashen's ideas aren't used as for the basis of a lot of courses. I've not seen that to be the case. There are obviously courses that are based on his ideas, and I'm pretty sure there's a few schools around the world that also use his ideas as well. In my opinion, there's not enough. I would say that the vast majority of language schools still use the traditional grammar, speak early, speak after me, that kind of stuff, which doesn't really make any sense. And this idea of error correction, which it's not quite right, because I don't know. You probably could get to a decent level of speaking ability or writing ability using that. But it just makes more sense to not make mistakes in the first place. Get enough input, get used to the language, by listening to it for 6 months to a year, reading to it a lot as well. And by doing that, you subconsciously start to understand the grammar and how to speak it, and it will come out naturally. You'll make less mistakes doing that. If you do what he's saying to do and you try and actually error correct, and you say, for example, you get in a conversation with someone, you say something, and if that person corrects you, which very unlikely that they will in the first place, but say it's a teacher and they correct you, you write that down, say you're being really productive with this, and you put the correction into Anki. It doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to remember how to say it the next time that you go to say that phrase. It's a very convoluted way of doing things, when you could simply just do what humans have been doing for a millennia, and that is sit down, listen to what is being said, and understand it over the course of months to years. Which it's long, it's painful, it takes a long time. I get that, but that is how it works, and you can't really argue with
because
that.
I think that the input hypothesis has errors and negatively affects millions of people trying to learn a language. I have an obligation to talk about
Millions is a bit much.
So let's get specific. What exactly is the problem with the input hypothesis? The first problem is that the hypothesis can immediately be shown to be false by a specific but very common group of people called receptive bilinguals. They are people who have a highly proficient understanding of language, but they cannot speak or write it. This situation is really common among the children of immigrants. The family moves to a new country, and the parents continue to speak the language of the old country, but the children will adopt the language of the new country. And in that situation, it's common that the children will be able to perfectly understand the language of their parents, but will have a varying ability to express themselves. Now, you cannot argue that these children are not receiving comprehensible input. And not only is it comprehensible, but it is meaningful. It is input from their own parents about their own life. Yet, some of these children cannot speak or write the language of their parents.
This is a simple case of it's not enough input. And also, it depends, I suppose. It depends on the situation of the individual child. If we take his example of, say, the child can understand most of the language but can't speak or write. Well, writing, for a start, is a trained thing. It's something you learn at school as a kid. If you don't actually learn how to write, you're not going to be able to write. It's quite a common thing. I'm pretty sure most people know that. It's in order to write, though, you do need a lot of reading, because where you're going to get the all the words and the vocabs and everything from, where you're going to understand how books are laid out, how you're going to understand how certain forms of writing are written in certain ways, you're going to need to read to be able to get that information. And so, you will still need input, you'll still need listening and reading to be able to actually write. But when it comes down to actually physically putting pen to paper, it's a thing it's something that has to be trained. Kanji in Japanese, for example, is the most common example of this. This is the case for a lot of Japanese people in Japan in modern day. They can't write kanji by hand because they don't do it anymore, because they type on their phones or they use the computer all the time. And so trying to recall stuff by writing is something that unless you've been trained to write in the alphabet or the language that you are fluent in or whatever, unless you've actually trained yourself to write, is something that isn't going to come naturally. Speaking is a very similar thing. You still need to train yourself to a certain extent to speak. Now, if you've got enough listening, and you've built that level of comprehension, you've got like 90% of the language down, you can understand pretty much most of the language, you're still going to be able to speak. I don't know any child that is going to have that much level of comprehension and they're not going to be able to speak in that language. They're still going to be able to speak. That's not a thing. So I don't know why he's saying that, because these kids will still be able to speak their mother tongue. It's not going to be as good as say if they move to England or they move to the US and they're learning English. It might not be as good as the language of the country that they're in, because they only have their parents to get input from. And if they're not speaking to their parents that much, and they come home and they go up to their room and they watch YouTube in English for long periods of time, they don't really speak to their parents, then they're not going to be able to learn how to converse and speak in that language. We forget that a lot of language ability comes from other sources opposed to our family. And so, if you've only got two sources of input and you don't really speak to them on a daily basis that often in that language, then you're not necessarily going to be able to maintain or keep up that level of speaking. Now, obviously, if he's saying that they speak to them on a daily basis, on long periods of time, and they are obviously speaking to their parents to some degree, because if they couldn't speak, then they wouldn't be able to speak to their parents, and that just doesn't compute. Their parents wouldn't be able to speak to them, so there would be no conversation. So there is obviously some degree of speaking in these cases. So I really don't think this is a very good example, but sure, I mean, if that's
And this is just one example of asymmetrical bilingualism. In fact, in general, bilingualism is misunderstood. It is extremely, extremely rare that people who speak 2 or more languages will have equal abilities in all of them.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
Even though this is a well-known fact, and also totally natural, this creates a great deal of shame for some people who want to honor their parents and honor their culture through language.
That is probably another part of it as well, is that these kids maybe, if they haven't learned to speak properly, maybe they're ashamed to speak, and so that they don't want to speak, as opposed to saying they can't speak. It's more of a case that they probably don't want to. They probably can speak conversationally a little bit with their parents, but more than that, if they were to speak to a random stranger on the street in the same language, say they're from the same country and they try to speak to them in that language, they might not want to, because they might be embarrassed of their language ability because they don't have much speaking practice. I can see that happening. That doesn't mean that they haven't acquired the language through input. They obviously have, because they wouldn't be able to understand the language in the first place. I don't know.
But the fact that people do not have equal abilities in all their languages is not surprising to me at all, because I know something that everyone knows if they take a moment to reflect. You get good at what you practice. And that's why I have an obligation to talk about why this obsession with input is so dangerous, because it doesn't explain the full story. And I think mainly it's a problem of definitions. First, let's ask 2 vital questions. 1, what does it mean to acquire a language? And 2, what do you want? Okay, so first, what does it mean to acquire a language? If you define language acquisition, if you define knowing a language as being able to comprehend it and process it and understand it, then I suppose that the input hypothesis is correct. But that is hardly what most language learners want. It's not an accident that people call themselves English speakers or Japanese speakers when they talk about their language abilities. The ability to speak, of course, is quite valued and, in my experience, considered a fundamental skill.
Man, I don't understand how you can have this view. Oh dear. Sure, you can learn to speak. You can learn to become a Japanese speaker. You can learn to speak English. But if you don't understand the language fundamentally, how are you going to have a conversation with someone? It doesn't make any sense. You have to be able to converse with them. And in order to do that, you must get input. You must get immersion. You must get enough listening practice to be able to understand what they're saying. If you really want to get to a high level of fluency, a level where, you're like Matt versus Japan, or even me, I know I'm not that high. I'm a basic level of fluency in Japanese, but if you want to get to that level of being able to understand your speaking partner and understand what they're saying, you need input. If without that input, if you were to just practice speaking with this person over and over again, and try and build up some conversational sort of Japanese, and then use textbook grammar to sort of build in and sort of process and sort of figure out what you want to say, then sure, that will work and that will get you to a level of Japanese, but it's not going to get you to the point where you can speak naturally, where you can speak without thinking about how you're going to say the next thing. You can speak without making mistakes, and you can speak without understanding. You'll end up speaking without understanding a lot of the other person's saying. There's just so many things wrong with doing that way and going about it that way. If you're serious about acquiring a language and learning a language to the point where you are really, really good at it, then yeah, you need a lot of input, you need a lot of listening, and a lot of reading. It's just how it is.
I wonder how many learners would believe in a teacher that says, in my classroom, you will learn to acquire language, but not produce it. Let's do a thought experiment. So I sit down and I watch a video on YouTube from a surgeon that shows me how to perform brain surgery. I totally comprehend the video and everything that the surgeon does. Have I acquired the knowledge of this operation?
Okay, two things here. First, the I understand what he's saying about the classes. A lot of students don't learn languages. Well, if they went into that class, they'd probably be like, this doesn't make much sense. I'm going to leave. Or they will probably think it's a bit weird and ask the teacher why this method works differently. I don't actually think a lot of people would leave. They'd probably just think, oh, this is a different way of doing things. Most people don't think about how languages are learned and acquired. And so I don't think that would really be an issue. But it's an interesting thing that he would say that, because I think the opposite. I feel like, telling students to speak from day one in a Japanese class is just insane and just ruins their accent and ruins their grammar, ruins the way they speak, and just makes them sound like idiots. So it's just a really bad thing to do, in my opinion. So I just completely disagree with that. And then that analogy doesn't make any sense. That's a completely different topic. Language isn't anything near brain surgery. It's a completely subconscious process. It's got nothing to do with looking at something and watching something and understanding it like that, and then being able to do it again, like something practical like brain surgery. It's a case of a speaker says something that is comprehensible. You hear it, you understand it. You might not necessarily be able to reproduce it on the spot and understand exactly what they say, but you subconsciously, your brain starts picking apart that sentence, picking apart the grammar, understanding what's going on, all the patterns and stuff. And the more of this that you get, the better a job your brain can start doing of piecing together the puzzle and producing an overall understanding of that language. And that's how it works. It's not rocket science. It's not brain surgery. That's a very odd analogy. It doesn't make any sense to me, but very sure.
If not, how many videos would I need to watch before I acquired the knowledge? Is that knowledge useful? And how many videos would I need to watch before you feel comfortable with me operating on your brain? But apart from that, think about how the idea of selling the importance of input discriminates against a majority of the world's languages. The fact is that most of the world's languages have never been written down, ever. But we have all become indoctrinated into the idea that recorded language is king. That if it's written in a book, or recorded as a podcast, or put on television, then it is real language that needs to be digested. And once you've done that, you have acquired the language.
Okay, that's a bit of a weird thing. I don't think anybody feels that way. I think a lot of people that learn via input just realize that this is how it's done. So here's the thing. You don't necessarily have to use a podcast. You don't necessarily have to use a book. You can speak to native speakers and you can converse with them. You can do how Benny Lewis does it. You can start speaking with them from day one with as little Japanese as you know as possible. The problem with doing that is the fact that you will make mistakes, train a bad accent, and you'll produce a lot of errors, and it'll just cause you a whole bunch of issues in the long run. And so what I recommend doing, and what a lot of people in the space that recommend input recommend doing, is to listen to podcasts, read books, listen to audiobooks, listen to things that are meaningful to you in the language to get good listening practice, so you can build up that base of the language, the core language, vocab, grammar, all that good stuff, before you start speaking and start making these mistakes. And that is the point of doing it. And so, if you're the kind of person that wants to speak to natives from get-go and you just don't want to do this way of doing things, you don't have to. You can do that and you'll be fine. You'll just not sound as good in the long run, which, if that's okay with you, then that's fine. That's perfectly fine to do. But if you want to do this naturally, do this the way that babies do it the way that that our brains are designed to do this, then you have to just chill, sit back and consume the language for long periods of time without speaking. It's exactly what we did as kids until we were like 3 years old. We couldn't say a word. We would just consume. And then you start being able to speak the language as time goes on. And so, yeah.
Well, apart from a tiny % of languages on the planet, that attitude won't get you very far. Apart from the fact that most languages produce hardly any output, so there is little or no input to digest, how will you ever use that language if you don't know how to speak it or write it? How do you think you will be accepted as a human being and a member of a community or a culture if you can't participate in the most fundamental of all human actions, sharing? And maybe that's the part that upsets me most about the input hypothesis. It's not generous. It doesn't seek to contribute. It doesn't add anything. It just wants to suck on language.
Okay, so my battery's running out, so I'm going to be very brief here. So he's got a kind of a point there. A lot of the languages that around the world aren't necessarily recorded or written down, and so if you were to learn them through the input hypothesis and learn them through input, you would have to physically go up to people and speak. Unless you go up to them and say, this is what I'm doing. Can you just, be okay with me chilling here and not saying anything, which is going to be very rare. If you're an adult, you're going to have to speak and try and converse and make your way through society by doing that. That is, he is right. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. That doesn't mean it's incorrect. That's just further backing up the truth that this is the way things work. You still need to listen to them to understand it. It doesn't make any sense.
Language like a parasite. And that brings us to the second question, and by far the most important. What do you want? That is the first question that any good teacher asks. And so it's also the first question that should be considered by any good teaching theory. If you want only to acquire language, then please spend all of your time and energy on comprehensible input.
That's fine.
But if you want to use language for the reason it was invented, communication, then you need to follow that basic logic of you get good at what you practice. If you want to get good at reading, read more. If you want to get good at speaking, speak more. If you want to get good at writing, write more. And getting good at all of those things will require years of hard work and a healthy dose of deliberate practice.
Yeah, that is correct.
Please don't let the promises of false prophets and prophets rob you of the gift of language, which isn't about understanding language, but about understanding other people and understanding yourself and making a contribution to society. Because now, more than ever, the world needs to hear what you have to say.
Okay, that's pretty much the end of the video. I'm going to briefly cover this because my battery's running out. So the prophets thing was very odd. The only people that I know that are really making money out of this are people on YouTube that talk about this. But again, he's doing the same thing, so I don't really know where that's coming from. There's obviously a few courses online that also do that. Oh no. Okay, my camera died. I'm just going to keep talking. So yeah, I don't really get his argument about profits because there's not very many courses that use input as a base. But I totally agree with what he's saying about practice. There are 4 separate sections of learning a language, and each 4 of those needs deliberate practice. You need to be able to learn to read. That takes its own skill set, and you need to be able to, obviously understand how the language is read and all that stuff. Speaking is its own skill set in its own right. I mean, we know this from native speakers because there are certain people that can speak better than other people. I'm one of the people that don't speak very well, as you can probably tell from watching this video. This guy is probably one of those people that can speak very well because he sounds very sophisticated and speaks in a proper tone. So that in itself isn't necessarily to do with language learning. That's kind of just a skill that is a skill that you can practice. And learning to write, again, is a skill that isn't really to do with language learning. It's a skill you practice. It's just something that you kind of build upon after you've understood a lot of the language. At the end of the day, you need a base. You need a core. You need to be able to understand what the other person's saying. Where he says it's not about understanding the content, it's about understanding the person. Yeah, that is completely true and completely correct. And so in order to be able to understand that person, you need to be able to listen to a lot of the language, whether that be through conversing with actual native speakers or whether it be from watching a TV show or watching an anime or watching podcasts. It doesn't matter as long as it's native speech and it is, at the same speed as a native and it is not directed towards people that are learning the language. It's natural native speech. It is good language to use to practice your listening skills and to acquire the language. That is how it works. So, guys, let me know what your thoughts in the comments down below and what you think about this. I just don't think that this guy really knows how exactly it works and how it's. I don't know if he speaks a second language or not. If he does, I'd be interested to know. But at the end of the day, language is acquired through input. It doesn't matter whether you speak to someone or not, or whether you use different resources. You need a lot of listening and a lot of reading. And, whether Krashen's input hypothesis is correct or not, that is still the case. It's certainly the case for me. I needed to be able to understand the language in order to converse with my girlfriend. So I needed to listen a lot to Japanese to be able to do that. And sure, I spoke to her and I used her as, in a way, to train my listening skills and my speaking skills. But I also spent, many more thousands of hours outside of those conversations training my listening skills by using all sorts of different media. And that massively helped my Japanese progress. Without doing that, I wouldn't be anywhere near as good as I am today. And so I completely disagree with the majority of what he's saying. But yeah, I mean, he's probably not going to see this, but if you, it's a good video. I have to say, it's well produced. I don't know. He's obviously playing the YouTube game very well, and he's obviously doing good stuff on his YouTube channel, helping people out to learn English. And so I respect that. I completely respect what he's doing. I just don't agree with this message at all. I kind of had some afterthoughts after recording, and I just kind of wanted to put them in here at the end. I feel like this video is just very contradictory overall. He's very against the input hypothesis, but then the title is The Myth of Input. And so it's as if he's, saying that input itself isn't a thing and doesn't work, when in actuality he's also saying that you need to practice all 4 parts of language learning, and listening is one of them, and reading is one of them, and those are both forms of input in themselves. And so I don't really think he's thought through this whole argument properly, and he's just kind of, put a video up and sort of just gone with it. But if he doesn't agree with the input hypothesis, that's fine. There's reason to believe that it's not perfect. It's not 100% accurate. There's probably some things wrong with it. It's why it's a hypothesis. It hasn't been fully tested. And that's perfectly fine. That's, what science is there for. That's what research is there for, is so that we can make assumptions and work off them and, test them and go from there. But at the end of the day, we know for a fact that you need input to be able to understand a language. You have to somehow get listening, get reading, in order to be able to, understand listening and reading, and be able to eventually speak. And so, yeah, you need input at the end of the day. And so I don't really fully understand the whole point of this video, really. That's kind of where I'm at. I don't know. If you're going to learn a language, if you want to learn a language, you actually want to know how to learn a language, check out my blog, check out the rest of the videos on this YouTube channel. You need input. That's all I'll say, and we'll end it there. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found the video useful and enjoyable. If you did, leave a like down below, subscribe, and you can check out my Patreon for extra content on there, early content, as well as my Japanese Anki decks. If you are learning Japanese, that should be very useful for you. So yeah, guys, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you. Bye.